1854. Massachusetts couple feeds entire town on human flesh. In the year 1792, in the town of Salem, Massachusetts, where dense forests crowded timber houses and an aging chapel, a horrifying story was whispered on the biting winds, a story not recorded in church registers or town chronicles, but one that lived on in the fear of those who had tasted it. It was the story of Amos and Clara Hawthorne, a couple generous with the savory cuts of meat from their slaughterhouse, but behind which lay a ghastly secret, because at the close of the 18th century, the smoke that rose from the Hawthorne's slaughterhouse did not just carry the scent of roasted meat and herbs, it carried a curse, an unquenchable hunger, and the price of turning a blind eye to meals that were too delicious to question. This is the story of Amos and Clara Hawthorne, the proprietors of the ill-fated slaughterhouse in Salem. Salem at this time was no longer the site of the infamous witch trials, but it still carried a somber air. The people lived by hunting, farming, and a harsh faith. The winters here were long and brutal, snow burying the trails, and wild game growing scarce. Famine was a constant specter, and the people survived on stored potatoes, prayers, and meat whenever they were lucky enough to get it. But there was one place where meat never seemed to run out. On the edge of town, where the forest met the frozen fields, was the Hawthorne slaughterhouse, a structure of dark stone and wood, with heavy iron doors and a chimney that never stopped breathing plumes of thick, grey smoke. It belonged to Amos Hawthorne, a tall, bearded man with a friendly smile, and Clara, his wife, a woman with lustrous blonde hair and a gentle voice, but whose eyes sometimes glinted with a cold, calculating look. The townspeople loved them. When a family lost their corn crop, the Hawthornes would send over salted pork ribs, neatly wrapped in wax paper. When a blizzard buried a farmer's barn, they brought a rich, hot stew, so potent it could melt both the snow and despair. When the winter of 1791 was so harsh that the deer vanished and livestock froze to death, it was the Hawthornes who kept the entire town from starving. No one asked where the meat came from. Some rumored the Hawthornes had a wealthy relative in Boston who sent regular shipments on night coaches. Others whispered they had a secret farm hidden deep in the woods, where even the bravest hunters dared not venture. A few wondered, but not for long, because to wonder was to go hungry, and the Hawthornes always made sure no one went hungry. The slaughterhouse stood behind their timber house, a solid structure with iron hinges and heavy bolts on the doors. It was always locked, except on butchering days when the chimney spewed black smoke and the aroma spread like a warm promise across town. People said they could smell pepper, bay leaves, and rosemary in it, but there was always another note, faint and acrid like the smell of metal. Most ignored it. Only Father Samuel Ward, the new priest, shivered slightly whenever the wind carried that scent past him. Inside their home, Amos and Clara lived as respectable people. The curtains were carefully embroidered, a harpsichord was polished to a gleam, a parlor held portraits of ancestors, and a grandfather clock that ticked with steady regularity. No one ever saw them buy livestock, and no one was ever invited to see what they kept in the cold storage out back. But people noticed something else. Strangers passed through town. Trappers, merchants, people looking for work, and they often stopped at the Hawthornes for a warm meal or a place to stay the night. Amos and Clara, ever hospitable, would welcome them in, offer them a glass of hot cider and a hearty plate of stew. Those strangers never complained about their hospitality. In fact, they never left at all. A merchant from Marblehead was last seen entering their house in January. His carriage was later found abandoned by the Ipswich River, empty. A young woman seeking work in Boston was said to have stayed with the Hawthornes for a night. No one heard from her again. The excuses always came easily. He must have found a boat. She probably changed her mind and went back. Wanderers never stay in one place. The town didn't investigate. After all, there was always meat on the table. Amos would often stroll through town in his thick coat, carrying linen-wrapped parcels of meat for the poor families, always smiling, always kind. Clara stayed closer to home, tending her garden and the fires in the slaughterhouse. Her apron often had dark stains that people assumed were from berries. The children sometimes called her the kind lady, and every afternoon, the smoke would rise. black as night, coiling into the grey sky, and Salem would eat. They always ate. No one knew that beneath the storehouse, behind a false wall, was a staircase leading down to a cold cellar, a cellar with hooks hanging from the ceiling, a stone table with rusted shackles, and a leather-bound ledger with names written in black ink, followed by dates and cold notes. Like firm shoulders requires a longer stew, or young, the meat is sweet, needs little seasoning. Not yet. At this point in the story, all they knew was that the Hawthorns had a talent for cooking and a bottomless supply of kindness. When asked about his source of meat, Amos would just laugh. "The Lord provides," he'd say, and the town would laugh with him, and they would chew a little more deeply, and they would wipe their mouths. And none of them, not even the priest, would ask where the bones went. Not yet, because hunger has a way of teaching people what to ignore, and gratitude, when fed with warm meat and silent comfort, becomes a form of collective complicity. But Salem would soon learn that the smoke didn't just rise from oak wood and spices. It rose from sins that could not be burned away, and a secret that was left to simmer until someone finally tasted the truth. In the dead of the harsh winter of 1792, the town of Salem was surviving, strangely well. While neighboring communities struggled with famine and the killing cold, meat remained on every table in Salem, tender, rich, and always stewed to perfection. People praised the Hawthorns' kindness. They spoke of God's providence. But few dared to acknowledge the obvious. There were no cattle in the pens, no squealing pigs, no deer in the woods, not anymore. The town's hunters returned empty-handed, their guns cold, their traps empty. The poultry had frozen weeks ago, yet the villagers still ate roasts, sausages, and the rich stews served at every gathering after the church service. All, of course, thanks to the Hawthorns. Amos and Clara seemed untouched by the hardships around them. Their skin was rosy, their smiles never faded, and they never asked for payment. Only a heartfelt thank you, or perhaps a promise of help someday. People called them good neighbors, kind souls. Some said their slaughterhouse was blessed. But Father Samuel Ward, Salem's young new priest, was not so sure. He had been sent from Philadelphia in the autumn, tasked with strengthening the faith in this remote town. With only a few years of experience and a bag containing a few prayer books, he had arrived with optimism. But the longer he stayed, the more that optimism began to freeze into something darker. The town seemed pious, but it was quiet. Too quiet and willfully ignorant. They didn't ask questions when strangers disappeared. They didn't seem to care. Father Samuel first noticed the pattern during a conversation with Mr. Miller, the carpenter, who complained that no one from out of town came for orders anymore. "They come down the Boston Road," he grumbled, "but they never come back." When Father Samuel asked what he meant, the man just looked toward the slaughterhouse and muttered, "Ask the Hawthorns. They always have meat." At first, Father Samuel dismissed it as local gossip, jealousy, and superstition. But then he began to review his personal logs. In 6 months, he had noted 8 missing travelers, all of whom were last reported to have stopped at the Hawthorns' place. A wool merchant from Marblehead, a fur trapper heading north, a young woman looking for a relative, a soldier returning from the war who never made it home. Their names were noted as passing through, but never with an entry for departing. Father Samuel's suspicion deepened when he noticed something else. The Hawthorns never bought livestock. Not once had they purchased a pig, a sheep, or a cut of meat from the town's small market. Not a single local farmer had sold to them in months. Yet, the chimney of their slaughterhouse puffed smoke. Day after day, hour after hour. One Sunday afternoon, Father Samuel stood behind the heavy oak doors of the church and watched Clara cross the square, a basket of smoked sausages in her hand. She placed it on the table at the community gathering, smiled gently, and quietly departed. Children played. Women gossiped. Men raised their cups in a toast. Not a single person questioned the origin of the food. That night, Father Samuel sat alone in his room, trying to sort through the chaotic thoughts, the suspicion, the fear, the sheer strangeness of it all. The town was being fed, yes, but it was not a blessing. It was a devil's bargain, and something told him the price was already being paid. Later that week, A traveler named Silas Blackwood passed through town. He was a fur trapper, a rugged man with sharp eyes, the kind not easily intimidated. Father Samuel quietly warned him against accepting the Hawthorns' invitation. "Do not eat their food," he said. "Just pass through." Silas scoffed. "Father, I've slept in woods far scarier than this. A kind couple offering a stranger a hot meal. I'll take my chances." He was seen entering the Hawthorn house at dusk. The next morning, his horse was still tied to the fence, his pack still intact, but Silas Blackwood was gone without a trace. When Father Samuel asked around, the villagers shrugged. "Must have left at dawn," someone said. "Probably took a shortcut through the woods," said another. But Father Samuel had checked the forest trail himself. There were no tracks, no signs. And that night, the slaughterhouse chimney spewed its familiar black smoke, thicker and heavier smelling than ever before. Father Samuel could not sleep. He opened his window and nearly gagged on the smell that wafted up. It was rich, almost sweet, like spiced, roasted meat mixed with something coppery. He lit a candle, made the sign of the cross, and whispered a prayer for the soul of Silas Blackwood. The next day, as if nothing had happened, Amos himself appeared at the church with a steaming bowl of stew. "For you, Father," he said with a beaming smile, "to keep you warm in this cold." Father Samuel stared at him, trying to find a crack in the friendly facade, a falseness in the voice, a shadow in the eyes. But he stood there as wholesome as ever, broad-shouldered, hands clean. There was nothing monstrous about him, nothing to accuse. So Father Samuel took the bowl, but he did not eat it. Instead, that night, he dug a hole behind the church and buried it, his hands trembling. Something was very, very wrong in Salem, and Father Samuel now understood the town did not want to know the truth. The meat was too good, the Hawthorns were too generous, and hunger had become too familiar. The next step, he knew, would require more than prayer. It would require proof he hoped he would never find. But soon, a child would go missing, and all doubt would be devoured. There was a reason children were told to stay out of the woods. It wasn't that the trees were dangerous, but that they listened, they saw, and they never forgot what you showed them. Thomas Reed was 12 years old, bright and curious with sharp eyes and a habit of exploring when no one was looking. His mother, a widow, kept a tight rein on him. But children born in Salem always found a way around the rules, especially when the snow fell thick and the adults were distracted by their own worries. The Hawthorn property fascinated Thomas. Every time they brought soup to the church, every time smoke coiled from their chimney, he wondered how they got so much meat. He never saw them lead cattle home, never saw a pig or a sheep in their yard, yet there was always meat, always. So one afternoon, while his mother was busy mending a shirt, and the town was preparing for the winter festival, Thomas crept behind the Hawthorn storehouse, silent as a ghost, hiding behind a row of pine trees. He didn't dare get near the smoking slaughterhouse, but his attention was drawn to an old cellar door beneath the storehouse. It was slightly ajar, perhaps left so by carelessness. Curiosity overpowering his fear, he gently lifted the door and slipped down the creaky wooden steps. The air below was damp and cold, thick with the smell of earth, fermenting cider, and something else, an indescribably sweet and metallic odor. He hid behind large wooden barrels and peered deeper into the cellar, where a single candle flickered. And then he saw it. What he saw was not an animal. It was a woman, naked, hung upside down from a large iron hook mounted on a ceiling beam. Her skin was pale, and her long hair nearly touched the bucket placed beneath her, which was slowly filling with something dark and thick. Beside it was a stone table with glistening metal tools. The room was silent, save for the sound of a blade being sharpened on a stone, coming from a dark corner. Thomas stumbled back, a scream of horror catching in his throat. He turned, scrambled up the stairs, and sprinted home, not daring to look back. He fell into his mother's arms, babbling nonsense about a body, a hook, and blood in a cellar. His mother, horrified, hushed him. "You were snooping on the Hawthorn property. You'll be punished, Thomas." No one likes a liar and a storyteller, but Thomas insisted. All evening, he spoke of what he had seen. The figure, the hook, the bucket. By morning, he was gone. His bed was empty, his woolen cap still on the pillow, the front door untouched. No one heard a sound in the night. The town whispered that he had run away, afraid of his mother's anger. Some said he must have gotten lost in the snowstorm. Only one person, Father Samuel, believed otherwise. Father Samuel's hand trembled as he added another name to his notebook that morning. One more name, one more disappearance. He visited Thomas's house, comforted the frantic mother, and then asked the question no one else dared to. Did the boy say where he saw these things? The mother hesitated, then nodded through her tears. He said it was in the hawthorn cellar. I scolded him for lying, but now she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The slaughterhouse chimney was breathing smoke again, thick, black, and almost smug. That night, Father Samuel could not sleep. He paced the cold wooden floor of the church, praying silently. The snow outside fell thick, pressing against the stained glass windows like spirits trying to find a way in. He knew he had to act, and soon, the next morning, Father Samuel walked through the town square, watching Amos and Clara greeting people. Amos, with his generous smile, was handing a parcel of meat to a widow. Clara, in pearl grey silk gloves, was gently patting a child's head. They smiled, they chatted, they accepted thanks for their kindness. Father Samuel approached them. "May I have a word?" he asked, his voice deliberately calm. Amos turned to him with a warm expression. "Of course, Father. It's about the boy," he said. "Thomas Reed. He's missing." He paused, looking them straight in the eye. He said he saw something in your cellar. For a fleeting moment, there was an almost imperceptible shift in Amos's expression. Not fear, not guilt, just cold calculation. "The boy has an active imagination," he replied, his voice even. "We always try to be kind to the children, but some get lost in their own stories." "Was he on your property?" "No more than any other curious child," Amos said smoothly. "You know how children are, Father. Always making up fantastic tales." Father Samuel looked at Clara, who stood still, her eyes downcast at her clasped hands. She said nothing. She never spoke when Amos handled the questions. He left with a nod, but something had changed. The Hawthorns knew he suspected, and he knew they were watching him. 2 days later, Thomas's woolen cap was found, caught in the brambles near the creek, behind the Hawthorn property. It was caked with mud and snow. On it was a small tear and a dark, almost black stain. The town constable, an old and tired man, dismissed it. "Could belong to any child," he mumbled. "Kids lose things." But Father Samuel said nothing. He simply walked back to the church and stared at the burning candle on the altar, whispering a prayer for a boy whose only mistake was looking too closely at what others chose to ignore. And the smoke still rose. The town still ate, and no one yet asked why the Hawthorns never seemed worried when someone went missing. Because once you've tasted something too rich to forget, you'll do anything to keep your palate from remembering what it cost. No one saw Father Samuel the night he decided to break into the Hawthorn property. The air was cold, smelling of snow and pine, the kind that seeps into your lungs like a warning. Salem was asleep, hushed under a dim moon, and the Hawthorns had gone to a neighboring town for a festival. Their carriage having rolled out at dusk, Father Samuel had watched and waited. And now, with the property quiet, he crossed the church graveyard, past the old maple tree, and moved silently into the woods behind. Their timber house stood like a silent fortress, solid, dependable. No one would ever have thought it was anything but warm and safe. But now, with its windows dark like empty sockets, it looked like something else, a trap built of kindness. He circled around to the storehouse and used a small iron bar to pry open the cellar door. The wood groaned, his breath fogging in the air. There was no alarm, no other sound. Below, the cellar was dark and as cold as a tomb. It smelled faintly of damp earth and cider, but the metallic scent of blood still lingered somewhere. He didn't know what he was looking for. He only knew he had to find something. Proof. Something he could bring to the people, something they could not ignore. He searched for nearly an hour in the dim light of his lantern, the cider barrels, the storage shelves, even a pile of old firewood. Nothing. No hidden door, no buried pits. It wasn't until he noticed a flagstone that sat slightly askew beneath the stone butchering table that his hands began to shake. The stone had a gap, small, deliberate, He used the iron bar to pry it up, and there, in the dark cavity beneath, was a single object, a leather-bound ledger, old and stained with something damp. He opened it. The first page was written in Clara's neat, careful script. "This is not for God's eyes. This is not for sin. This is to remember the flavor." Father Samuel turned the page, and another. His throat tightened. Each page listed a name, a date, and a chilling note. Silas Blackwood, November 1791. Tough meat, too sinewy, screamed a lot. An unnamed girl, March 1792. Good fat content. Was ill beforehand, but it didn't affect the taste. Elias Thorne, June 1792. Rich flavor, needed a long time to soften. Worth the effort. A message boy, August 1792. Cried incessantly. The meat was a little sour. The ink was smeared in a few places, but the entries were clear. Each one was a person, a real person, someone who had vanished. And on the final page, the ink was still new, almost wet. Thomas Reed, December 1792. Curious, a bit thin, but the meat was sweet and quiet. Didn't struggle much. Father Samuel slammed the book shut. He could barely breathe. The cold cellar air seemed to be draining the life from him. He wanted to vomit, to scream, to pray, all at once. But instead, he tucked the ledger under his cloak, replaced the flagstone, and left the property exactly as he had found it, back in the church. He bolted the door, lit every candle he had, and sat trembling before the altar. He didn't know what horrified him more, that the Hawthorns had done these things, or that they had done them with such calm, methodical grace, like artisans chronicling their craft. The next morning, he went to the home of Judge Hathorne. No relation, the town's eldest and most respected man. The judge opened the door, surprised to see the young priest. Father Samuel handed him the book. The old man read for a long time, page after page, then stopped at the entry for Abigail Proctor, May 1789. Father Samuel watched the color drain from his face. "That was my niece," the judge whispered. "The family thought she ran off to Boston." "She didn't run off," Father Samuel said, his voice dry. There was nothing else to say. The news spread quickly, but not loudly. Whispers started in the tavern, murmurs in the smithy. Women held their children closer. Men glanced at the slaughterhouse chimney with a new unease, but no one confronted the Hawthorns. Not yet. That evening, Amos and Clara returned home, and surely noticed the disturbance in their cellar. They said nothing, but the next morning, Father Samuel found a still hot bowl of stew on the church doorstep, covered with a white linen cloth. There was no note, just a small ivory button resting on top. It was identical to the one from Thomas Reed's coat. Father Samuel didn't touch it, didn't uncover it. He dug a deep hole in the church garden and buried the entire bowl, the foul smell of cold earth overpowering the false aroma. The next day, the slaughterhouse chimney spewed a blacker smoke than ever before. And this time, even the most stubborn of the villagers began to look up. The winter festival arrived on a frigid Salem night. The snow fell lightly, dusting the rooftops and tree branches in silver. Despite the cold, the whole town gathered around a large bonfire behind the church. Under the flickering light of lanterns, families brought what they had: a jug of hot cider, a few loaves of cornbread, an old fiddle. But the main course, as always, came from the Hawthorns. This time it was a meat soup, a thick, dark concoction, fragrant with root vegetables and winter spices, bubbling in a giant iron cauldron. Clara ladled it out gracefully, her red lips curving into a slight smile every time she handed someone a steaming bowl. And this time, Father Samuel refused to eat. He stood under a snow-dusted pine tree, watching how the villagers cheerfully devoured it, how they laughed, how they hummed along to the music, how they slurped and leaned back in their chairs with contented sighs. They never asked where it came from. He thought of the ledger hidden in the church, now wrapped in cloth and locked in an iron box. He thought of the woolen cap in the brambles. He thought of the button and the bowl of stew he had buried. The truth was laid bare in his mind. But truth meant nothing without witnesses willing to look. Then it happened. A woman cried out, not in horror, but in confusion. She had bitten down on something hard, something buried in her soup. She spat it into her palm. A button, small, made of ivory, chipped around the edges, identical to the one from Thomas Reed's coat. Mrs. Reed, Thomas's mother, who was standing nearby, saw it and her face went white. That's Thomas's," she whispered, her voice trembling. Father Samuel stepped forward. His voice rang out, clear and cold as ice. "This is not venison," he said. The music stopped. Some people froze. Others blinked slowly, confused. "This soup," Father Samuel said, "is not from cattle, nor pig, nor any beast of the forest. It is from one who walked among us, one whom we failed to protect." The hawthorns stood perfectly still by their cauldron. Amos let out a strained laugh. "Father," he said, his voice attempting a gentle tone, "perhaps the cider has made you delirious. You haven't eaten. Come, sit down, won't you?" "I have seen your ledger," Father Samuel replied, his voice hardening. "I have read the names." Now the crowd turned, their faces darkening, not with anger, but with disbelief. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men shifted uncomfortably. Still, no one sided with him. "You would accuse a couple, who have fed this town through a hard winter, of murder?" Judge Hathorne said, rising from his seat. His voice was calm but sharp. "On the basis of a button?" Father Samuel looked around. "On the basis of dozens of names, a missing boy, and a kind of meat that tastes like no animal I have ever known. You've refused to bless our food," another man added, his voice laced with suspicion. "You've been different ever since the Reed boy ran off. Perhaps it is you who is unwell, Father." Amos set the large ladle down. "We are hospitable people," he said, his tone wounded. "We have never turned away a hungry mouth. Even when others had nothing to give, we gave. And now this." Clara, at his side, began to sob, her tears welling up. Whether they were real or performed, no one could tell. She bowed her head and wrung her hands like a wronged woman. The villagers murmured. The looks were not for the Hawthorns, but for Father Samuel. They trusted this couple. They brought food, warmth, smiles. Father Samuel brought sermons, and now accusations with no proof they could accept. He saw it clearly. They did not want to believe, not because they couldn't see, but because they had. To admit what the soup really was would be to admit they had eaten it. And once you know the taste of sin, you either cleanse yourself in truth or drown in denial. Father Samuel walked away in silence, his cloak fluttering in the snowy wind. Behind him, the feast resumed, more cautiously, more quietly, but it resumed. That night, Father Samuel sat alone in the church. The candlelight trembled. The ledger lay on his lap. He whispered the names, one by one. Silas, Abigail, Elias, Thomas. Each name felt heavier than the last. Outside, the slaughterhouse chimney glowed red against the starry sky, and far off in the woods, someone began to hum a soft, lilting lullaby. It was the same one Clara often hummed while she stirred her soup. There are moments in a man's life when faith is not enough. By the third night after the festival, Father Samuel understood a terrible thing. Salem had made its choice. They would not stand up. They would not accuse. The truth was too heavy, too ugly to hold. If he wanted justice, it would have to be delivered, not requested. He had studied the Hawthorns for 2 days, where they went, when they left, how they locked their doors. He memorized the path to the back storehouse, where the hidden cellar lay. That was where they did it. Not inside the cozy home, not in the hospitable kitchen they presented to the town, but out back, in the shadow of the woods, where screams could be swallowed by the howling wind and falling snow. Father Samuel made his decision as the sun set on a Tuesday evening. He removed his clerical collar, dirtied his cloak, and dusted his boots. He would become the thing the Hawthorns loved most, a stranger. At dusk, he walked down the path to the Hawthorns' house, head bowed, feigning a limp. When Clara opened the front door, he didn't look up. He just said, "Good evening, ma'am. I'm a trapper. Lost my way in the storm, and I was wondering if you had room for a weary traveler." Clara blinked once, then smiled gently. "Of course, you poor man," she said softly. "Come in. We never turn away a hungry soul." She gave him a seat by the fire and poured him a mug of hot cider. It was fragrant, sweet, and spiced, the kind of sweet that coats the tongue for too long. Father Samuel knew what it was, a potent sleeping draught. He stirred it, brought it to his lips, then deliberately let the mug slip from his grasp as if from sudden exhaustion. As his head slumped onto the table, he closed his eyes, but only halfway. Through a narrow slit of vision, he watched the hawthorns. Amos entered from another room with a satisfied smile. The glint of his cleaver caught the candlelight. "He'll do," Amos said. "Thin," Clara murmured, "but he looks healthy." A hunter's meat always has a good, strong flavor. They moved toward him. They took his arms firmly, like butchers preparing an animal for the block. Not a guest. Father Samuel remained limp, breathing shallowly, every muscle cold with control. Then Amos leaned in and whispered, "It's better when they don't fight. Less bruising." That was the moment. Father Samuel's eyes snapped open. He shoved Amos back with all his strength, sending him staggering. Before Clara could react, he burst from the room, kicked open the back door, and ran straight for the storehouse. Inside, the stench was worse than he had imagined. It was not the smell of spices or smoked wood. It was the thick, cloying smell of old blood, the smell of death and fear. Inside the storehouse were iron hooks on the walls, buckets, tools, chains, a drain in the center of the stone floor, and in the far corner, a dark, closed wooden chest. He didn't need to open it. He struck a match, dropping it into the pile of oil-soaked rags he had prepared. The fire caught fast. The storehouse and slaughterhouse went up like a torch. In seconds, the entire structure was roaring. Father Samuel stood outside, the snow falling around him, his eyes stinging, his face burning, but he did not move. From within the inferno, he thought he could hear screams, not of animals, not of the hawthorns, but of many voices buried under years of crime and silence. And rising above them all, the furious, echoing shrieks of Amos and Clara carried across the woods. "You've burned our harvest. You've burned our livelihood." Father Samuel stumbled back as the roof collapsed. Embers flew into the night sky, glowing like angry stars. The villagers, alerted by the blaze, came running, some with buckets, some with axes, others with just breathless horror. They stood and stared as the slaughterhouse consumed itself into ash. Afterward, nothing was said. The next morning, no one asked questions. The Hawthorne property was a charred ruin. The couple was nowhere to be found. The constable recorded the event as an accidental fire. No investigation was launched, but in the quiet corners, people whispered about what they had seen in the ashes. The tools, the bone fragments, the lingering stench. And though no graves were dug, the sin was buried deep. Father Samuel left town quietly 2 days later, the ledger and a Bible wrapped in his satchel. Behind him, Salem began to rot slowly from the inside. But not all fires cleanse. Some only expose, and this fire had revealed what no sermon ever could. The fire was supposed to be the end. But as the smoke cleared, Salem learned that some endings only reveal what should never have been hidden. By dawn, all that remained of the Hawthorne slaughterhouse was a skeleton of timber and black ash. The structure that had been the town's source of life was now a charred ruin, its chimney still coughing faint wisps of smoke into the cold morning sky, and beneath it, beneath the stone foundation, beneath the lies, the ground had cracked open. The villagers came slowly at first, a few at a time. The brave ones, the curious ones, the ones who still hoped, even now, that Father Samuel had been wrong. They gathered in a wide circle around the scorched foundation. No one spoke, and then someone gasped. A child's ribcage, scorched but intact, had pushed up from the soft earth like a relic reaching for the air. Beside it, a femur, as long as a grown man's forearm, a blackened skull, its jaw frozen in a silent gape, and next to that, a hair clasp, silver, dented, and unmistakably engraved. Mrs. Abigail Putnam fell to her knees. She reached into the ash and picked up the clasp with trembling fingers. "My daughter," she whispered. "That's Mercy's clasp, the one her grandmother gave her. She went missing 5 years ago. They said she ran off with a sailor." She looked up, her eyes wild. She was afraid of the sea. Others stepped forward, silent, pale. A man took off his hat and mumbled, "We always thought John lost his mind. But I remember he went to their house once for hired work. Never saw him again." A woman clutched her apron and whispered, My cousin. He was visiting from Andover, stayed with them one night, said the stew was delicious. He'd never tasted anything like it. Then he left, or so we thought. Another voice. I found a shoe buckle once, near the edge of the woods behind their land. Brass, too small for a man. One by one, the town began to remember. The memories they had buried, the questions they had silenced, the gut feelings they had dismissed as nonsense. But the fire had done what no priest, no ledger, no confrontation ever could. It had unearthed the truth. One bone at a time. Father Samuel stood apart from them, his back against the cold stone wall of the church, watching it all unfold. He did not speak. He did not move. This was not a sermon. This was not justice. It was grief, and it was collective. Soon the constable arrived, his face ashen, his hands shaking. He stumbled through the ruin and said, too loudly, We'll gather all this, identify what we can, give them a proper burial. But everyone knew there were too many bones, too many fragments, too many forgotten names. At one point, the gravedigger stopped counting, but not before he had reached 40. In the center of it all, Father Samuel saw something strange. A wooden chest, half-burned but untouched by the fire, unearthed by the heat. He walked over and knelt beside it. Inside were dozens of small trinkets, brooches, necklaces, shoe buckles, rings, even a child's lock of hair tied with a ribbon. Items no one would miss individually, but together they told a story. Trophies, mementos. Proof that the Hawthorns had not just killed to survive, but had kept pieces of their victims like devotional relics. Clara's neat script was carved into the lid. We remember them by taste, not by name. Father Samuel slowly closed the chest and whispered, God forgive what no man can forget. By dusk, Salem was no longer the same. Children were kept indoors. Doors were double-bolted. Meals went almost untouched. The Slaughterhouse, once the hub of town gatherings, was now a scar on the land, roped off with stakes and twine. A town that had feasted together at the festival now whispered in fragments. She always hummed that lullaby when she stirred the pot, didn't she? That cider, it always made me so sleepy. How did we never ask where the meat came from? The truth had burned through, and now it was festering, not because it was over, but because they had all tasted it, and no amount of prayer could wash the dead from their mouths. That night, Father Samuel knelt alone before the altar. He lit 12 candles. He whispered 12 names, some from the ledger, some he knew from town, some that were never written in any book. And as the flames flickered, he wept, not just for the dead, but for the silence that had let it happen. He whispered, their bones are not just under this soil, they are under our hearts, and we let them rot there. The wind rose outside, whistling through the cracks of the church. A faint cry echoed from the woods. Not a ghost, just a memory. But sometimes a memory is louder than a grave. Some stories die in the fire, but this one did not. The flames that consumed the Hawthorne slaughterhouse in the winter of 1792 may have devoured the flesh, the stone walls, and the secrets buried in the cellar, but they did not destroy what was left in the mouths of those who had feasted there. They did not burn away the shame. In the weeks that followed, Salem became a town of whispers. The laughter that once rang from the taverns on cold nights was gone. The clatter of cutlery at dinner became muted. Even the dogs fell silent when they neared the ruin of the slaughterhouse. And no matter what meat was served, venison, rabbit, turkey, nothing tasted the same. Because now, everyone wondered, Father Samuel stayed just long enough to preside over 12 burials. Simple wooden crosses were planted on a patch of land that was never blessed, only stared at from a distance. He kept no records, gave no final sermon. When asked why he was leaving, he didn't answer. He simply walked down the road out of town, one foggy morning, carrying only his Bible and a burden no man should have to bear. But Father Samuel could not outrun the story. Wherever he went, Boston, Providence, Hartford, people would eventually recognize him. Not because they knew his name, but because of what they felt around him. A presence, a melancholy that hung in the air like the smell of smoke long after the fire is out. In every town, it was the same. He would rent a small room on the edge of town. He would stay only a few nights, and someone would always dream. It would start with the smell of meat soup, rich, familiar, sickening. Then the dreams would grow darker. A child's voice, a button in a palm, a cellar door that would not stay shut. More than once, an innkeeper would knock on Father Samuel's door in the middle of the night. "You were screaming," they would say, begging, calling out names we don't know, but Father Samuel would not explain. He would just bow his head, thank them, and be gone by morning. Soon, the towns began to speak in hushed tones. "There's a priest who travels alone. They say he's haunted. He doesn't seem to age much. Don't eat if he blesses your table. The food tastes strange." Meanwhile, Salem withered. Weeds overgrew the footpaths. The church closed. The ruin of the slaughterhouse was fenced off, but no one dared touch it. Judge Hathorne moved away. The market grew sparse. And the last child born in the town cried for a week and never opened its eyes. Eventually, mapmakers stopped, including it on their lists of settlements, but the people who had lived there remembered, and they carried that memory like a second tongue, one that twitched every time soup was on the stove, one that recoiled when chimney smoke rose too thick. In private, many confessed to Father Samuel in the later years. "I liked it," one man whispered, drunk and ashamed. "I didn't know, but I liked it. I still dream of her, Clara. She's holding a bowl of soup and smiling," said another. "And maybe the worst of it, Father, is that sometimes I miss the taste." In his final years, Father Samuel returned to Salem only once. He walked through the chest-high weeds. He found the 12 crosses, old and rotting. He lit a single candle, set it on the ground, and said only 4 words, "May you be forgotten." But as he turned to leave, he heard it. Not a voice, not a ghost. Just the wind whistling through the bare branches, and in it, a faint lullaby, like a woman stirring a large pot of soup. It is said that even now, if you stand where the Hawthorne slaughterhouse once stood, when the fog is low and the moon is pale, you will hear it too. The humming, the scraping of a knife on a stone, the chewing. Some even claim to have seen 2 figures in the mist, one tall, one graceful, moving through the trees with sacks on their shoulders. And others swear that in the neighboring towns, travelers sometimes disappear on cold winter nights, and someone is always buying a large quantity of herbs and spices. The story of Salem was never written in books. It was not taught in schools or carved into any stone, but it lives in the whispers, in the rumors, and in the mouths of those who ate too eagerly, who praised the flavor before questioning the source. The Hawthorns were gone, but their hunger never was. Thank you for listening to the end of the story. And if you are still here, let me know where you are from and what time it is. There is a comfort in knowing we are not alone.